How'd you come to find yourself involved with the Rural Ed Association and the work that you're doing?
Well, it started back when I started at Bergman a long time ago as a teacher coach, and then I know it started developing at that point because of the consolidation things there in the 80s and then going into the 90s. And so as I worked my way up the ladder from coach and teacher to principal and to a superintendent, I'd been the superintendent at Mountainburg, and they had been members, and so I got involved there and ended up being on the Arkansas Rural Ed Board. And when I retired in 18, I got the opportunity to be the assistant director. A good friend of mine was the director, and so he retired at the end of this in July, and so I took over as the executive director at that point.
You'll have to excuse me. My Great Dane likes to drop in on the interview.
Hey, no problem.
Hi, buddy. Well, I was curious about that. I actually didn't know much about it, until I started running for office and digging into things. But I'm glad to know you've kind of served on every level then, so you've got experience looking at it from a lot of views that probably most people wouldn't have. But well, that'll lead me to the next thing, because something that's really hot on Twitter right now, popping up, everyone's making comments about it, is the teacher salary, and it talks about the increases for teacher salary. And in terms of rural schools, what are your thoughts on that, and what does that look like?
Well, I think everyone wants to pay the teachers as much as they can, because they are the lifeline of the school district. If you have good teachers, you're going to have a good school system. And I think the big issue with the small schools is that the governor has increased the minimum salary, and I think it's up to $36,000 by the end of this year. And then he had proposed to move it up to $42,000, and I think they were going to pay out of the matrix $4,000 of that, and then had a fund for the first year to pay the other $2,000 that the small schools would have some trouble reaching. And I think the biggest concern, if that goes into effect, if the legislators do follow through with that, is that $2,000 per teacher after the first year, the schools will be on the hook for that, and that would be an unfunded mandate, which would create some issues. But I think everybody is for that $4,000 raise, and it's covered, and they don't have to worry about that extra too. Now, everybody would love to have that extra $2,000 for every teacher that they have, and not forgetting about the classified staff as well. Try to increase their pay as well. So those are some issues that have to be worked out, and I know the legislators are getting a lot of different recommendations from a lot of different sources. So I hope that they come to the determination that they figure out that every school is not funded equally, and so they figure out a way to help the small schools out.
So, and that's the concern I also see for that is there's so much disparity within certain areas of our state, or to be fair, even in a Senate district, there could be one school where the pay can vary greatly. And so I wonder about how that rolls out, if they do something like a $46K salary, and Springdale's good with that, but Bergman gets crushed by it. And when you start to mention the matrix, the funding matrix, people's eyes tend to gloss over a little bit. So I thought I'd back you up just one little bit. And can you break that matrix down into layman's terms, if you will?
Well, I think it's based on a 500 student school, and there's so many teachers that are funded by this matrix, and most of the small schools, have to. The standards require you to teach these certain classes. In smaller schools, you may have 2 or 3 people that are taking these upper division classes, so they either do it through video or distant learning type things, or they hire a teacher and that has 2 or 3. So then when you look at the average of that teacher's students for the day, you throw in those 2 or 3, and they may have 20 or 30 in the rest of them, but it brings their average way down. So it gives you a false impression of that teacher and how the matrix breaks down. A lot of people don't understand that the matrix is a funding and not an expenditure model. And so that creates issues too, because people want to say, well, you got transportation issues in small schools, so they have made a categorical fund where they help that. So then they want to break off other things, and then when you start doing that, then the students or the schools that have the most students get the biggest advantage to those things. So again, it's a very difficult thing. That's why they've had so many different groups doing studies and trying to make recommendations for that. And so the matrix is what the funding process of the schools from the state standpoint is based on right now.
Gotcha. So on that thought process, the concerns that I'm hearing are this, just because it's based upon this, teacher salary that we're talking about. But if you are a teacher in, say, a 1A or 2A school, and you have 20 to 30 years of experience, then I'm told that you will make less per year than essentially a new hire would in other districts in the state. Exaggeration, or is there some truth to that?
There's some issues with that. Depending on how many year schedule, a lot of districts have a pay scale based on yearly, and then there's education tied to that and all the other things. Well, some districts may just go up to 15 years, some may go up to 30 years. And then,
okay,
you have an increase each year, and depending upon the school, it may be, $300 or $400, and it may be $800 or $900, depending on that. So when you bring up the base, then if it's a 15-year school salary, then you have an issue there where somebody that's been in it 30 years may not be getting any extra money, and those new teachers are coming in a lot higher than what the other teachers that have been there a long time started with. So there's issues with that. But, I know they're looking to try to make sure that those young teachers stay in the school business, but you have those teachers that have been there a long time. And when I started teaching, the older teacher said, "Hey, you need to think about us too, because in these pay raises, if it's not across the board, then if they put too much on the start, then we're getting ripped off at the end." And so, you feel sorry for those veteran teachers, but there's got to be a way that they can.
Well, seems like they should be getting the pay raise first, if you ask me. But at least it ought to roll down to some degree, just to keep people from, what we're seeing now is just people leaving the field altogether or taking early retirement to go actually be employed in something else. That's does such a huge damage when you have a teacher with 10, 15, 20 years of experience that then leaves, to whatever, go make more money on Etsy making birdhouses. That's not good.
No. They mentor so many young teachers too, and that's the thing that we're going to lose out on if we're not real careful. Those teachers leave, the older teachers leave, and there's not a whole lot of direction for the younger teachers then.
Do you feel like you're seeing, or have we seen anywhere that we can track it in data, like teachers leaving, say, 1, 2, and 3A schools to go to the 4s and the 5s and even maybe higher ed? Do we have that?
I think it depends on the part of the state that you're teaching in. A lot of teachers will come in, get some 2 or 3, 4 years experience, and then they can get hired for a lot higher salary at a bigger school, and that's what we're seeing now.
Okay.
Things that are being done to try to keep from that happening. Trying to raise your own. Encouraging parapros to stay and helping pay some of their college expenses, and they're able to do it online, and so they're not missing their work, and they can do it at different times of the day or week or month or whatever it is, and that's going to help some, I think. And Arkansas Rural Ed gives 2 scholarships to people that are parapros that stay, and it's $1,000 a year for 2 years. We do it north and south of I-40. We have 2 parapro. We have 2 vocational scholarships that we give, and then we give 4 scholarships to employee children and also to graduating seniors, and it equals about $24,000 a year that we put into scholarships.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the issue then of, let's say, and again, if I say something that feels like an exaggeration, please point it out. But because I try to reword a little bit of what you're saying too, to make sure I understand it and that people understand it. But we sort of have an issue where our smaller rural schools, if you will, have become a springboard for the bigger schools that are ultimately going to pay them more money. In any retail environment, this is a massive money pit when we see this happen, when we hire people, train them, and then lose them in 24 months. You're constantly stuck with recruiting costs, which is essentially just marketing costs, personnel costs, all that. But then you have that downtime of acclimating somebody to your system, maybe getting a new teacher set up with an old teacher for that mentorship. The whole cycle starts over in a nonstop process, at least in the retail world. Does that have, I'm sure it has some of the same sort of ramifications. Does that keep 1A schools, 2A schools just in constant recruiting mode, or what's really the damage of that?
I think we're seeing a teacher shortage in all levels, even the big schools.
Okay.
But they have less problems because they have a bigger group to select from. But smaller schools having to look at alternative people that are working on their degrees and those kind of things, just because there's nobody there that can take that teaching position. I think using Virtual Arkansas or different groups like that for distance learning has helped some, but you're right. You get somebody in there that's being a good member of the community and people really like them, and then they decide to go chase the money pool and go somewhere else, and then you have to have somebody else come in. And small schools, the community is the big thing. If the school is not there, the community is not going to be there. I mean, it's just, they dry up, and it's very unfortunate. And I think that's the fear that most small schools and communities have right now, is how long are we going to be able to survive?
That's kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about, especially with your experience working through, as you said, sort of the previous rounds of consolidation and stuff that our state went through. I have heard that, as you worded it like that same fear from a lot of teachers in the smaller areas, or even administration, to be honest, that when a school closes down, the community tends to close down around it. And that's something I don't think a lot of people understand.
I agree. You look at the different small schools that have consolidated, that community is never the same. And, the pride and the just community spirit that schools bring to that area is huge. And if it's not there, and you look back at people that you graduated with and the pride that they took in the small schools, it means a lot. And then if that school's not there anymore, then you may have different things that happen, reunions and stuff, and it's not the same because you've got other people that may have been your rivals that now are your classmates, and that's not all bad, but it's not all good either.
Yeah, it's funny you mention it. As a kid, I graduated high school in 2004 in Viola, and there was one point, I don't know how serious it got because I wasn't as plugged in then, I guess, but at one point there was talk of school consolidations, even in my era of time, and the thought was that we would get consolidated with Salem, and all I could think about was like, well, that's no fun. They're our closest, that was the ones that I loved it when we played Salem in basketball. It was the highlight of the whole year for me, just because they were the closest school. They weren't necessarily always our rivals. Viola was pretty good at the basketball side of things, so we tended to compete well. Yeah, and which is another thing. I mean, I know sports sometimes. The importance of sports gets elevated to a place maybe it shouldn't at times. I share that skepticism, but usually that kind of stuff's paid for by boosters anyway. They're not pulling that out of teacher pay, and not that I've seen, but anyway. But for a school of Viola to have class sizes as small as we did, to be as competitive as we were, both in sports and I'll even say in academics, particularly in certain areas, is a testament that our school deserved, to exist and thrive and to serve our community. So anyway, I would share that, but I'll kind of get off this and get on to the next subject because it does relate to consolidation, but that's the topic of school choice. Very heated, becoming a very important issue, something that everybody's talking about, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, but before I do, maybe I could share what I am feeling my understanding of it is, and you tell me if I'm wrong or right and correct me. How about that?
All right.
So I've talked to I've talked to people on both sides of this issue, and the way I have walked away understanding that school choice started as essentially a voucher program for kids with special needs that needed to go to special facilities or facilities that were better adapted to their needs. And so a voucher was given that the tax would follow that kid essentially, or that the state would fund that kid's school because the public school was unable to service that whatever that particular special need was. And that's how it started, and since then that has been, it's sort of like you give them an inch, they take a mile thing, to where now it's just they're advocating for a free-for-all. If you want to send your kid anywhere, then what you pay in tax for your kid to go to the public school will be redirected essentially. I know it's not, like a direct pass-through, but here's the biggest discrepancy on this school choice issue. Advocates for it say that the tax does not follow the kid, whereas I'm reading online that it clearly does. So can you clear that up for me, and just let's talk about school choice a little bit, what it is, what it isn't?
Okay, from a practitioner's standpoint, being a superintendent, there's students that if they had to go to a private school for their specific needs, then the money came to the school, but you had to pay the money to the facility that they went to. And so the way again, there's different aspects of school choice. I think that there's been a very calculated group that has worked to try to get their foot in the door, as you said earlier, and increase different amounts of funding that went to private schools. To they're even talking about the homeschool, that the money would stay with the homeschool student, paid to the parents or whatever else, wherever they're enrolled at. It hadn't come to fruition yet, but it could. So I think the public school people are really worried that, they receive the funding for the number of students that they have, average daily membership. And if those students that choose to go somewhere else that and it takes away from the number of students that they have in their school system, then they have less funding, which means probably have to make cuts, which means, teacher layoffs, all kinds of things that, and services that they offer now may not be able to be followed through with like it is now. So I think that's the biggest concern, the number of students that could be lost, the recruitment of those type of students in schools that aren't even in existence now, but somebody sees that money flow and opportunity to make some quick money, and then the education of the child then is put in jeopardy. And there's some homeschool folks that do it the right way, that their kids really have a great opportunity to learn and do well, and then there's others that are avoiding truancy, some other issues, and so they sign their child up for homeschool, and the learning is not as effective as what it would be if they were in a school setting.
So one thing is the fear that school choice will erode some funds from the public school system. But if you're losing kids to the private sector, you're going to hopefully remind me, but there's a number there, like 350, I think. If you get below 350, yes. At what point do you start having to apply? What is it, like what do they call that when you apply for basically something to not be consolidated?
A waiver type thing?
A waiver, okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I think that, and we have some school districts that are less than 350 that are still in existence, but they have to meet certain criteria in order to remain open, and being financially solvent and providing the standards that are required, and there's a lot of different things that go along with that. But when I talked about the matrix earlier, it's based on a 500 number school. So if you're below 500, then you're not going to be funded as much as you would be if you're above 500. So that creates other issues for small schools, from the funding standpoint. I'm not sure. Is there any other part of the question that
I don't think so. I think that was good to point out, to understand that funding changes either under or over 500, but also if your school attendance falls below 350, then you have to apply for a waiver to not be consolidated, and you can ride that waiver with some extra qualifications. Like, essentially, you could just keep reapplying for that waiver if you're meeting standards. Is that correct?
I think the Department of Ed comes and makes sure that everything is, they look at all the different test scores, they look at the different, financial aspects of it and all the other things that's required, and as long as you're meeting those, then, but the number, every time the number decreases, it makes it more difficult to reach those goals.
So I'll ask ask it in a simple way, I guess, but it seems like there would be just if you were if you were going to go start a McDonald's franchise or something like that, you know that you're going to have a base level operating cost that you're going to have to meet. It kind of seems like we don't really have that for our schools. We would just, rather than give them the base level funding that they need, we either make them apply for waivers and go through that process, which is even more burdensome, or they just have to shut down. I wonder, and maybe as a part of rural ed you have some access to this or know about this, but I wonder if there's other states out there that treat their rural schools or their smaller schools, or when I say smaller, in this case we'll say schools that have under 500 students. Do they have them in a separate funding pool, or treat that separate, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing?
Being an affiliate of the National Rural Ed Association, I'm in contact, and we do a lot of Zooms and stuff, and hear the other people talk, and it's real similar all around. I think their concerns are just like ours about, the fear of consolidation, shutting down communities if schools are shut down, funding. Different states have different ways to fund things, and overall, I think ours is probably as good as anybody anywhere around. It's just that it needs to be funded on the. If you meet the standards, then you should be funded for that. They say that half a teacher because you only have 2 students in there. Well, it should be a full teacher because you're having to pay a full teacher salary. And I think those are some issues that need to be discussed and have been and will continue to be.
Well, let me roll on to the next point then, as we are kind of looking to the future and hearing new recommendations. You mentioned I believe you mentioned a new adequacy report or hearing.
Yes, they're required by law to have an adequacy group, and it's made up of the Education Committee on the Senate side, which are 6 of those, and then on the House side, and I think there's 20 or so of those. And there's a chairperson from the Senate, and there's a chairperson from the House. So they're co-chairs, I guess you would say. And they have a yearly, they meet each month, 2 times a month, and usually it's a Monday afternoon and a Tuesday morning. And they hear all these law things that are required by the law, coming from the BLR, which is the Bureau of Legislative Review, and they go through all the statistics and all the data that the ADE has. The ADE also is required to do reports for them. This last year, or last couple of years, they had an independent group come in. They paid them to make recommendations. They involved a lot of different size schools, a lot of different teachers, administrators, parents. They went through and was very thorough on that. They made recommendations to the adequacy group, and the adequacy group has, by November 1st, has to return their recommendations to the governor and then to the legislative body. And so this last on Monday and Tuesday this week, they made their final recommendations, or they met to go over to determine what their recommendations were going to be. And so the Senate side had several recommendations, and the House had several recommendations, and then they have to, I think anybody that sent anything in is part of that report, and it goes on to the governor and to the legislative body. Now, the final determination is determined by the full Senate and the full House, and they have to approve these. And teacher salaries and all the other stuff that we've discussed here is all part of that. And it's interesting to see what their final recommendations are going to be, because they didn't, after Tuesday, they didn't have a consensus on the recommendations they were going to do. So I'm not sure where it goes from there. I know they have to have this thing turned in by November 1st. They may call another meeting and try to narrow it down, but the way it is right now, it's going to be interesting to see what recommendations actually they do come up with and send to the governor.
What kind of recommendations do you anticipate, maybe, or particular? I don't want to try to get into guessing what the future holds, but just to give people listening to this an example of the things being discussed, would teacher pay? Would that be on that list?
That's one of the big ones, teacher pay, and then I think that's the biggest one. And then there'll be school choice. There'll be some other things that come about there, and then there'll also be, I think the big discussion is the letter grade from the that's received from the Department of Ed. Based on test scores, based on other things. I think they had some discussion about that, and there'll be some other things that'll come about. But I think the recruitment, retainment, and teacher salaries are big on this year's recommendations. And there were all kinds of things coming from the Senate, and there were all kinds of things coming from the House. I think the House had theirs kind of a little more streamlined, like they usually do when they send it on to the governor. The Senate didn't have a consensus. They had several people that made recommendations, and that was sent. Everybody got to look at it from that were a member of that, and I'm not sure where it's going to go.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I'd be curious to see then. I have been following some of those conversations, and that's where I kind of got, some people were saying, no, we need to give teachers 46, we need to give teachers 48, or whatever, whatever they come up with there will be interesting. I'll just leave it at that. We'll see what happens there, won't we?
Yep.
Any, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but I have the feeling, in a sense, that public schools are under attack a little bit. Again, I hate to use that kind of term. I'm not trying to be sensationalist, but it does feel that there is a segment of the population that is upset with public schools, and rather than, my mindset would be, rather than get involved with the school board, rather than try to be more, involved, they want to turn their back on it, so to speak. And when we turn our back on the school, in my opinion, as we've kind of discussed, you're kind of turning your back on the cornerstone of your community in many cases. And so I really hope that guys like me, guys like you, other people out there can find a way to break that wall down and get more people to consider what it would look like to be an ally of the public school instead of an opponent, which I feel is like what I'm seeing a little bit. But I don't know if you care to comment on that, but I'll let you close it out for us. If there's any other topics you wished I would have talked about, or just if you feel like there's misconceptions that people have about public schools that we could chat about, or we could just end it here, Dennis, if you got that other meeting to go to. But let me know some closing thoughts.
I think people need to realize that public schools are required to take every student. Private schools choose who they want to come into their schools. They have a number, and then they can turn back special needs or anything else. But public schools are required to accept every student, and that's the biggest difference, I think. And when we look at private schools, they have some kind of things that they have to meet, but as far as the requirements and the things that go with public school, it's out there and everybody knows about it. Public school or private schools don't have to report any of that stuff, and they're not held to the same accountability that public schools are. In the same way with homeschool, there's a lot of issues that come along with that. Some people and some groups do it exactly the way it should be done, but I'm afraid that more than half don't, and that creates an issue for that student and those students from their learning and the education that they're receiving. I think that we're going to have to stand up and say, hey, this is our school, this is our community, we have got to take care, protect, and elect people that are going to follow their constituents and what they hold to be important, and to make sure that those folks are held accountable as well in their votes when it comes down to public funding, and to protect the small communities. And Arkansas, we have some schools that are large as far as numbers go, but it's considered a rural state. Mm-hmm. And if you compare it to other states, then our large schools would be small schools to most of those. And people don't realize that, I don't think. And there's a lot of support for our small schools, and I appreciate the effort that those legislators that are doing what they need to do to try to help in any way that they can. And I also or really appreciate the legislators being willing to work hard to make the right decisions. What I seeing here in the last several years, and it looks like it's a trend nationwide too, is that we're going to vote the way our caucus wants us to vote, not because that's what's best for my community and what's best for our students and what's best for our schools, but that's what we're going to do. And if we keep doing that, then the public education is going to get less and less, and what's going to happen, the segregation is going to take place because the ones that have it are going to be able to use it, the ones that don't are going to get left behind. And so we've got to keep that in mind and work as diligently as we can to try to make sure those folks that are down at the Capitol know how we feel, and try to do the best that they can to help us do the best that we can.